Hello, everyone, and welcome to another, albeit delayed episode of the War Report. But we are here no less, here to cover the news of the past week. And I want to start out with something that was really just a flash in the pan. I expected it to go further, but it seems like it didn't, and that is our little situation in the Caucasus Mountains. I got a map for this one, too. So, Armenia and Azerbaijan, two former Soviet republics. Now, this is going to be a familiar story. Stop me if you heard this one before. Two former Soviet republics have a border dispute. That's that's the joke. But this has been ongoing since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and as you can see, with their border with the disputed region, it's right there. Surprisingly enough, it's not that little bit that borders Iran that's separated from Azerbaijan proper, which, when I first heard about a conflict between the two, I assumed that was it. Now, this all allegedly started because Armenia shot down a drone belonging to Azerbaijan that was apparently made in Israel. So there's that, just to make it more convoluted. And then that resulted in Armenians taking to the streets, chanting "End the lockdowns, start the war." So they were very enthusiastic about that.
Right. Wow.
And this all escalated, of course, and firing of borders. Armenia really taking I, I would say, the offensive and moving in to the disputed territory. And this all happened over the course of last week, and it really fizzled out. But when this first started, you had Azerbaijan, more appropriately, which is ostensibly a American client state at this point in terms of everything that goes on there. Uh, very friendly with Turkey, but also conversely very friendly with Iran. And not bad relations with Russia, but it's definitely not in the Russian orbit. It's on Russian satellite as to the degree Armenia is, and the degree Armenia is, again, is questionable. Believe it or not, Russia actually has lost quite a bit of their grip on the former Soviet republics. That's actually been a big, area of contention in the past 2 decades. Believe it or not, but with what happened initially, it looked like Russia was backing Armenia's actions, Turkey was backing Azerbaijan's actions. You had tacit Armenian support from Europe. The United States stayed silent on the issue, but it looks like it's fizzled out because no side is really willing to commit to a conflict. And it seems what's happened over the past few days is Russia has really yanked a leash on Armenia and brought them back into line. And it looks like the issue is probably going to be resolved to the status quo, as most of these former Soviet border disputes are. Notable exceptions, but at the end of the day, most of the time when these things break out, both sides are eager. They lose their stomach for a conflict early on, and things return to normal.
That's right. And it's kind of like a repeat of what happened just a couple of years ago. Things ended very similarly. And, what's also interesting is the way the big powers have reacted to this. So the states are kind of quiet at the moment. Russia has um, attempted the role to intervene between the two in a diplomatic sense. They themselves kind of tacitly, in this case, support Azerbaijan. And I would think the reason is probably the same reason, maybe why the Americans are kind of quiet, and that is nobody wants to see an escalation there. Um, Turkey, of course, has taken on the side of Azerbaijan. Erdogan flexing again after reconquering Constantinople this week. Um, So yeah, and with the Russians, I mean, normally they've always had very good relations with the Armenians, but I think they look at the situation as Armenia essentially overreacting, um, taking things too far. Because of course, like one of the officers were killed, I personally don't believe Azerbaijan was, attempting to take over this contested area, Nagorno, uh, away from the Armenians. It would never have looked that way. It would not never have been such a small, puny force. So, and also, Armenia has been, you know, kind of psyoped and gayoped for quite a while now, since 2018. So, I think um, everyone has a stake, and it's again very muddled. Most of the powers kind of have concern and empathy for both sides, and for different reasons.
Honestly, I think the biggest takeaway for this is that the end of Russian control of the region has been an absolute disaster. And I say that in the way of where I sort of say, oh, we need to return to empires, but honestly, we do. This is yet another example on top of the mountains of other examples of two statelets, these entities that are barely sovereign, serving the interests of foreign powers, going head to head, returning to a status quo, and not solving any of the pertinent issues.
Mm,
This is the problem with the idea that every little group needs its own state. We need to be committed to the sovereignty of X, Y, or Z group. We need to be committed to any of these multitude of things. Now, I am honestly of the position that the region would be better off if there were T90s in Yerevan and Baku tomorrow. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but honestly, I think if this flares up again, this is a great opportunity for both Turkey and Russia to assert their role in the region. Because you would think, typically, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with American uh, hegemony over the globe, it's their job to solve these small border disputes between these countries that hardly exist on the map. But if either of these two countries, and I think at this point Russia could probably balance them better, considering Turkey's, let's just say, unique relationship with Armenia. We'll leave it there for the sake of for the sake of brevity.
yeah.
And this is really an opportunity I see for the regional powers to sort out a border dispute. Now, I don't think that'll happen anytime soon. I think things will have to get a lot more out of hand than what they did this time in order for it to result like that. But I do see this in hindsight, now that the event has pretty much passed, as just a microcosm of what's happening worldwide. The American guaranteed peace, the American guaranteed security of the world, is crumbling before our very eyes. Look, there were these border disputes in the 90s upon the initial breakup. There's been flare ups again, but these incidents become more frequent as the current world order retreats.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing too is these little countries. I think my hot take is they're doing this intentionally, not because they're actually willing to go to war. I'm sure this in these camps there are hotheads who really believe that it's time to go to war, and there's a portion of the public, not small, I would guess at least 10%, that would want to see it. However, I personally think the reason they do this is literally to get the big powers involved. It's a way to essentially get funding money. Like I can be your vanguard against this border dispute far off from your country or close to your country or part of your interests. If you do X, Y, and Z for me, it's no different when you see in Poland where like or Romania where they say I will host these missiles, and keep a hostile attitude towards Russia if you do that. And so, yeah, and along with what you're saying about like a decline in the previous world order is a kind of panic where, not unlike sort of with like the COVID issue of keeping everything in lockdown, destroying the economy, and basically getting big corporations, giving big corporations not only the big bailouts, but of course bonuses and the ability to buy all these other smaller fledgling companies or medium-sized companies that were competitors. Um, so it's a kind of an idea that like maybe the good times are coming to an end and you might as well get as much now because you may not later.
Yeah, I agree with that. And before all of this really settled down, I saw a few interesting things based on countries who were siding with other countries, and one that really stuck out to me. Do you know what former Soviet republic that is generally on good terms with Russia sided with Azerbaijan initially?
I, I don't know, Turkmenistan. I don't know.
Moldova.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Moldova did, and it's interesting because about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Moldova, with some of the protests there, they almost had an anti-Maidan where they purged the country of pro-EU politicians, and it looked like they were going to do that. Now, what interest they have, I don't know. Whether that was put on by somebody else, but again, the support of Moldova wasn't going to tip the scales of this conflict. At least in my opinion. But who knows? Who knows? Moldova could be the next great European power. Time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I would not have suspected Moldova. I mean, in some way, you could say that regionally they're not that far apart. However, I look at the Black Sea and I think like they kind of are, because I associate Moldova, I don't know, more as just like an Eastern Balkan country, like on that sort of precipice between Eastern Europe and Western Balkans. I mean, it's mixed, right? But yeah, that's a bit of a surprise, and that is interesting too, how they kicked out Global Homo for a little while. I mean, I don't know what their present status is, but I do remember that. That's one area where it didn't work as opposed to Armenia.
It is one of those cases, sort of with the elections in Estonia. I think last year, where you had that bulwark of ethnic Russians who still have affinity for their homeland, that really sway the politics there.
Mhm.
But with that, I suppose we can move on to, you know what? Let's change up the show order because there's been some interesting things happening in the Balkans. You did bring up the Balkans, so I feel inclined
Yeah.
to, and we'll start with Bulgaria now. In Bulgaria, there are current ongoing protests against the sitting government. Now, it's an interesting case because whenever you hear of protests, especially in Eastern Europe, you think, who's behind this? Soros, some other liberal billionaire of a certain undisclosed ethnicity, the U.S. State Department, Brussels. But I think we have found a new one. I think we have found a hybrid one, which will also give more of an insight into the direction global politics is going. You have an American supported protest, not against a pro Russian government, not against a so called neutral government. You have an American protest against a pro European Union government, as it stands.
Oh my God, Putin is laughing.
I mean, how many more victories can the man rack up? He gets his constitutional
I,
amendments, he gets Crimea.
well,
And
I mean, but if Trump is the Manchurian candidate, isn't it still between Russia and the EU?
but the resistance controls the State Department. Okay, the good guys are
Oh, I
still in
see.
charge
Yes.
there. Remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some New York Times piece, I think in 2017. It was the anonymous op-ed about how the resistance is secretly inside the White House, which I'm still convinced John Bolton wrote, and I think Given recent events with his book, that's actually not too far of a guess. Now, I think I initially said that just because I do not like John Bolton, but that I may be vindicating that yet. Time will tell. But I did have to bring that up. But it is interesting because the protests, their demands aren't anything outrageous. Just the broad anti-corruption protests you see in that part of Europe. Stop embezzling money. More money for social programs. Stop austerity. Just the very basic, the very general things. Not too rainbowy. If you're picking up what I'm putting down,
Hmm.
I haven't seen any of those sorts of flags. I haven't seen any trans rights signs. Granted, I mean, in some parts of the world, and Bulgaria being one of them. Now, you would think, okay, if they can pull it in Ukraine, they can pull it, in the rest of Eastern Europe. But apparently not. Even though it took some time in Ukraine, I'll admit it did take some time for them to warm up to it. But it was just a very general, broad thing. Now, this, of course, relates back to, and I'll tie this all together, and trust me, it'll make sense. I think this ties back into the brewing energy war because not in reference to Nord Stream because of course that's in northern Europe based on the name, but
Hmm.
Bulgaria has been very cooperative with Russian energy deals despite being a pro EU government. And I'm starting to think with the hostilities over Nord Stream that's extended into southeastern Europe over Russian pipelines in general. Now, this is all just speculation. I think it's still way too early to tell about any of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is yet another front in the energy war.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. In Bulgaria, some crazy stuff has happened. I remember not too long after the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, there was some kind of a decision about Nord Stream 2 that was in the process, and America was putting like heavy-handed pressure on them to not sign on and onto it because of course Nord Stream 2 was going to be going originally to Bulgaria. And um, that was altered because literally a day before the U.S. diplomat showed up, there was a terrorist bombing in along the highway, but this is a highway that goes inside the city, uh, in Sofia, and like Bulgaria is like one of those Eastern European countries that had very little terrorist action at all. So that was kind of like an interesting thing. And so, yeah, it might be connected. I can't say for sure, but it is something to think about.
I do think it's also too early on to tell, but I think the biggest takeaway from this is that there's been open disputes between the United States and the European Union ever since the beginning. Now, the European Union was admittedly a system established by the neoliberal world order so Europe could manage its own affairs, take some pressure off the United States while they focused on the Middle East and East Asia. And it worked to a degree. But again, I'd hate to give Trump so much praise because of how much of a disappointment he's been on so many other things. But then Trump came along, and his rhetoric alone threw that into a tailspin. Europe is less
Yes.
trustful of the United States, even the Brussels elite. You see this with people like Macron, people like, to a lesser extent, Merkel, who made her comments about American hegemony last week. And now you have these two groups. One, of course, that's still the hegemonic power of the world, and the reasonably sized allied power bloc are now having several internal disputes. Now, that started with trade under Trump, Trump's stance with trade deals with Europe, with pretty much every country, which, again, addressed a very legitimate concern. It's probably one of the things he's been better on in his time in office. And then you have, of course, the foreign policy issue. Europe more open to rapprochement with Russia than Trump is, despite his previous campaign promises and all the, let's just say, incidents between U.S. Russian relations under Trump and the Russia investigation, sort of the souring of relations there. And you're seeing this come to fruition, I think, at least on a small scale, with this sort of movement in Bulgaria where it's U.S. protesters versus pro EU government. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see this case elsewhere in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, some of these poorer, less developed countries. I doubt you're going to get this in France or Germany or Belgium, even though you never know. Things can deteriorate quickly to where that could happen. But I think for the time being, it's reasonable to say these will stay contained to Eastern Europe and maybe some smaller Western or Central European countries at the most.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So, while we're covering the statelet skirmishes, as I'm going to call them, that's the episode title right there, right in the episode. Serbia, a land very near and dear to you. You could say not quite your homeland, but it's quite literally adjacent. But
Yeah, yeah, and also lots of friends from there. So yeah, the protests have been going on for days now. Initially, the provocation was a new set of lockdowns because of a spike in COVID. And I don't know how many people know, but I know from friends who were in Belgrade during the lockdown. The lockdown was super intense. There were days where you couldn't step out at all. And to be truthful about it, like Serbia has not had some enormous death toll that other countries have experienced, but the lockdown has been severe. And there's a kind of a perception in Serbia with regards to Vucic that he's really always trying to please both sides. So on the one hand, he's going to demonstrate what a great lockdown leader he is. And on the other hand, he's going to get upset about, the latest problem that's developing in Kosovo. Um, but most of them, many Serbs, at least the Serbs that I know that are very good, close friends of mine, see him as a tool. They see him as, at worst and at best, completely incompetent. Um, Unable to act decisively, incoherent, and so on. So just basically a bad leader. And I was checking out some articles on the UNS report, and it seems like the Serbian protests are something that let's say that probably Russia would be happy about, and that the EU is concerned about, and because it could really flip things. And this comes on the heels of Thaci, the guy, the Kosovar president, who is now in Belgium at The Hague to begin proceedings for potential war crimes uh, allegations. So that's what's going on there. And I just wanted to bring up, this is just a quick aside about, the connection between, let's say, COVID and Western power or global financial power. It's come out that Belarus, which bought gas from the U.S. recently, was told that they could be given a IMF loan, a very large IMF loan, if they had gone along, if they would go along with the COVID lockdown. So that's what I mean about how these. Um, I mean, I guess for a lot of our listeners, there's nothing surprising here.
yeah, and for any newcomers, welcome. You picked quite the episode to jump into. Yeah, I would honestly recommend going back a few weeks to get some broader view on the current situation of the world right now. But for again, those of you regular listeners, all of this in Serbia also coincide. All this in Serbia, all of this in Bulgaria also coincides with the absolute chaos in Montenegro, the forging of
Yeah.
ethnic identity, schismatic churches. That hell, I would say that probably warrants an episode of its own at some point. But
Hmm.
today is not the day for that. But just know that Montenegro is in a state of chaos, a country of what 500,000 people carved out of a mountain, and there's still just so much going on there. And I actually didn't know about Belarus that it was contingent on the lockdowns. Now, I do think the situation surrounding the virus and the lockdowns and our measures to contain it and fight it have been odd. Now, some degree of
Mm.
lockdown was definitely necessary. I think a lot of the concern and fear about it when it was breaking out in China, when it was breaking out in Italy, was completely necessary. Now, am I saying life should turn completely back to normal? No, I think we should probably ease ourselves into this before we uh, start opening everything back up. But it has, as always, become a way for the vultures to feast, whether that be
Yeah.
the accumulation of capital through bailouts, through stimulus packages, through gobbling up smaller competition, or any of these things really. And of course, it's become yet another front in terms of the culture war, another way to humiliate people. Shutting down pretty much everything. But you know what? Those abortion clinics, those are essential services right there, and not nothing else. And it it does also the protests. In fact, the protests are responsible for lowering the infection rate, that sort of thing. So that plays in.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's, I just can't. I cannot believe the level of gay op here. It's just. Sorry, I'm just going to chime in just for a second. I was talking with a friend of mine. Okay, so he's a liberal, but he's not. He does not fall for all of it. You know, he'll say, for instance, pharma companies must be really enjoying this, and so I brought it up. He was getting agitated, you know, and I said, "Oh, come on, dude! Like all the news sources are saying this. CNN said it, and I mentioned another one. And what's worse is nobody's countering it." And he said, "CNN isn't legitimate." And I go, "Oh, I know, but nobody is countering it. That's the point. Nobody who could be perceived as legitimate is countering it." So yeah, I just wanted to say that it's completely outrageous.
Yeah, but it is interesting, and also again on the culture war thing, conservatives are dropping the ball on several issues that they could be exploiting this for. But again, that warrants an episode of its own at some point as well. And yeah, I'm just gonna keep
Yeah.
on stacking that to-do list higher and higher, and I will get to eventually the lazy med that I am, slowly but surely. but but the ultimate point I was gonna make about this, what I initially thought at the beginning of the year when this was breaking out in China and spreading across the world is this has been a massive blow to the credibility of the neoliberal world order and to the current government in China. It turned out to actually be very bolstering for both of them in certain ways. China seemed now I don't know the situation on the ground, whether infections have spiked there, how much information they're putting out, how much we know about it. But again, it seems like at least on paper their economy has recovered. Their global power and reputation haven't taken that much of a hit. Hong Kong just went through, which no, there's been no real opposition to that aside from some condemnation from the U.S. State Department and a like a slap on the wrist sanctions bill. But yeah,
Hmm.
like again, we'll get to that at some point as well with that this episode, next episode, whatever. But it's also been an entrenchment for neoliberalism in the West. Now, again, its ability to spread, I think, has been hampered by this. I think a lot more countries that haven't been fully integrated into the order or were sort of on the fringes have a bad taste in their mouth from it. For example, the situation in Italy, I don't imagine they're still very pleased with the European Union's response as compared to the response from the outside. I think in this particular case, Russia's response, their aid to Italy, but it did do a lot at home in the empire proper, to solidify it. As I said, with the increase in the corporate power, with big pharma, with a lot of the political narratives, again, and that goes back to the lockdown measures, whatever, and again, the now weaponizing of lockdowns as a foreign policy issue, as you mentioned with
Yeah.
Belarus. So it has given them a little bit of room to reach out and expand the empire, but it has hampered in that regard. But it gave a much needed bolstering, a quote unquote rally around the flag effect that was much needed for the continuation of these policies even just for another decade.
Hmm. Hmm. You know, you almost get the feeling like they want to tank the economy. Like, I understand it's not, you know, just the flu, but we are kind of getting at that point where I hate to be blunt and crude about it, but just how much are we willing to sacrifice for grandma? Like, how much of the rest of society do you want to bring down?
Yeah, and
Like, we're
I'm
in the double digit trillions right now. Double digit trillions. That's how much money has to be printed. Like, how are you just going to do that? How does this carry on without inflation? And you know, if you look at the last inflation that we had back in 2008, you know, there was like the initial shock, and then the real aftershock followed about 6 months later. Are we going to see that in October?
you know, I have to admit, and you can go back from episodes in February and March. I thought early on, you also thought early on, that yeah, this was going to be pretty serious. Now, it wasn't going to be a massive pandemic that kills hundreds of millions of people, but I thought it was going to be pretty nasty and that you might actually have to lock things down for the sake of saving lives. But it turns out at this point, I think, again, I think some degree of precautionary measures, some degree of lockdowns are necessary, whatever. But I do think honestly that they may want to tank the economy. They may see a way to profit off of this current downturn, and they're willing to drive up unemployment. They're willing to again take the temporary hit for the long term gain, which is really a rare thing for neoliberals. So when they do it, you know that they're serious about it.
Hmm.
But yeah, at this point, I do think that now that's passed, now that it seems like the infection rates have tapered off, now we have a better understanding on how to treat it and how to prevent it, we can start to ease our way back into it. And I would prefer a quicker approach, but again, that's all personal preference. And yeah, they have taken an issue that was ostensibly serious, or at least seemed serious at the beginning, and turned it into yet another neoliberal plunderfest, as they always do,
Yeah.
as these vultures always do. Now, of course, Western governments aren't the only ones guilty of exploiting this, I know, but I'm primarily concerned on that as somebody who lives under the rule of a Western government. I'll say that much.
Well, I mean, they're the ones who kind of set the tempo, and one has to imagine that let's say there's some theorists in other countries that are not really part of the Western global order, but are tied into it nonetheless, because virtually everyone else is. There might be a myriad of reasons why you would think it's necessary for you also to have a lockdown, even if, say, the numbers in your country don't justify it. Um, you know, everything from retaliations, isolation, you know, that next loan you want. There could be all kinds of things. Or maybe if you go higher up the rung, you know, you might think, yeah, they are going to tank it. And, you know, if we don't do this, then we won't benefit for what follows thereafter. Because I don't believe that they're going to actually, you know, tank the economy without having something else to replace it. That they'll never do that. They're not doing this to, you know, create total chaos. They're good at managing chaos. They're good at like spurring chaos, but also keeping it in line. But I don't think, you know, they're not going to you know, turn, you know, they're not doing this to turn New York into, like, I don't know, Lebanon in the 80s, or Mogadishu, or whatever. That's not, there's no way. They have, you know, something else is a brew.
Yeah, there's things they're willing to tolerate in the pursuit of a greater goal. And like I said, it's rare that they do that. So when they do that, you know that they're serious, or at least they think they have a plan that will work. Now, whether that will work, again, time will tell. But it is interesting to watch how this entire coronavirus crisis has simultaneously cut down a lot of the world order while reinforcing a lot of it as well. Where it's been almost balanced out. Where yeah, sure, it discredited a lot of the old practices, but also reinforced them as well. And honestly, I do think the big winners out of all of this are countries like Hungary. I know I go back to that talking point all the time, but a country that shut down its trade and travel early and continued on life relatively normally. Another country that did this was Georgia. Um, Israel is another one. You know, again,
Mhm.
it's rare I'll praise Israel, but I'll praise their immigration policy, that's for sure. But uh, yeah, so I do think the case has been made for stronger border controls and stronger trade and travel controls. Now, I know damn well that right wing Westerners, at least the ones who have any political capital or any media capital, will not exploit that. But I do think in the places where they can, it's gonna be like I think they've really come out on top of this. But ultimately, I do think what we have here is it set neoliberalism back a few years while simultaneously preserving it for another decade or so. It's one of the odder situations I think we've dealt with.
Yeah, and I mean that's you could just to sort of add to that. I would bring up, again, the UNS report had an article about the recent victory by Duda. And Duda only beat Trzaskowski by like 1.5%. But apparently, supporters have been vocal. They have said that one of the reasons that they voted for Duda is they believe that Tchaikovsky represented Jewish interests in Poland, and that's why they voted for Duda instead. Right. So that kind of signaling, you know, is very important to remember. We all know Eastern European countries are challenged. That's fine. But the truth is, they are doing things that are going to, in some way, that are going to protect the culture in one way or another. Because let's face it, laws established are much easier than laws to be removed.
Oh, absolutely.
They matter. They
And
matter, right? You can't just dismiss that and say, well, they have a certain number of these folks. It's like we can't talk about subversion and the long march into the institutions, and at the same time say, well, it doesn't matter really. Like, well, which one is it?
yeah, and insofar as that's concerned, I'll say the difference between the Western world and Eastern Europe is, Eastern Europe may be on a decline in several different issues. And again, demographically, people leaving, emigration, all of that. But I at least see an effort by their people and by even some of their governments to try to preserve what's there and not just plunder and pillage and abandon ship, as it were.
Well, I mean, at least what they're doing is preparing a normal home for return, because all these people, that are from Eastern Europe working in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Ireland, um, you could argue these governments foresee some pretty crazy times coming ahead, especially with 2020. I mean, 2020 is the big eye opener year, like no other. And this is the year that they've started introducing these laws. And I would argue that they're doing so because of a preparation of some kind of a return in case things will start to get crazier. And they will, because we know, like, there's no way, it would have been very unlikely, let's say for America's case. I don't say that this is universal, but it would have been very unlikely for the amount of statues to have been torn down had America's demographics been different,
Yeah,
right?
I, I
Because the
think so.
majority of the statues being torn down are, racial, ethnic, political, rather than, let's say, class driven, which is what happened in Eastern Europe, and somewhat ethnic. Um, so, you know, these Western European countries, you have like insane, you know, people who are the heritage of that country who are still supporting these policies, whether it's mass migration, whether it's like more guilt, but only for one group. What are the outcomes going to be in Britain? We saw a few statues going down. What are they going to be in 10 years? Like, so anyways, I sorry, I went off on another tangent.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. Now, to keep in line with our reverse order, do you want to do Libya before Syria?
Yeah, sure.
I like to change it up sometimes. I like to keep you on your toes. Now,
No.
Libya. The big news out of there is I think it's finally coming to fruition. We may see Egyptian involvement. Now,
Yeah.
nothing has been confirmed yet. There hasn't been a vote on it yet, for the Egyptian side at least. The LNA's legislature passed a motion calling for an Egyptian intervention. And as you can see on the map, GNA forces, the Tripoli backed government, they just keep on pushing further and further south into LNA territory that has been gained over the
Hmm.
years. And Egypt is growing concerned. According to the most recent news reports, they will be voting on it tomorrow, Monday, July 20th. The date will be for that vote, for a proper intervention into Libya. Tunisia expressed concern about the situation in Libya. And Turkey is still increasing their presence there. The dispute between France and Turkey has gone quiet, but it is far from resolved. Russia's been quiet on the Libya issue lately, and what I think is going to happen, and what I thought was going to happen for the past few weeks now, is it's going to fall on Egypt. Egypt will decide the fate of Libya, and that is based solely, I wouldn't say solely, but mostly on their intervention and the scale of their intervention. Do they move in to support the LNA government? Do they move in to fight against GNA forces and fight against these tribal and militia groups in the south? Now, admittedly, they're less of a threat, but they're pushing further north. They're now bordering the oil fields themselves, and that's Al Qaeda. That's these groups like Al Qaeda, ISIS, whatever. And Libya is turning to yet another powder keg, and the only country I would say in the position and with the will to even solve it in the LNA's favor is Egypt, and I do
Yeah.
think it's going to come to that in that vote tomorrow.
Well, when I heard that the government had passed some kind of resolution that would give the green light for intervention in Libya from Egypt, I mean, you can call it bluster because bluster always happens, but I think I took it the other way, that this is a serious sign that Egypt is willing to intervene. And I know Turkey is amassing more and more troops, and that's probably because they want a safeguard that they're going to be um, definitely capable of capturing Sitra, that town on the border in basically the northern western part of the country. Um, but yeah, it sounds to me like they are serious, and they haven't acted yet. Turkey, for that matter, has not acted yet, so they might be hesitant. Um, yeah, I agree with you. Egypt is serious this time.
I really would be surprised if they don't do something, if they don't send any force. Now, I doubt it's going to be a full scale invasion of Libya. I don't think, number one, I don't think that'd be necessary for the goals they want to accomplish, but honestly, at this point, the way I see it, and if I'm being drastic about it, from the
Mhm.
Egyptian point of view, it's intervene now or face a resurgence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the country. Something that Sisi, the current president, far from perfect. Again, many things you can criticize him on in terms of internal and foreign policy. He has done a good job in Middle Eastern standards, especially Egyptian standards, in keeping the Muslim Brotherhood at bay and keeping them away from power. And I
Mhm.
don't think he's going to let that be squandered by this uprising in Libya.
Yeah, it wouldn't take very much. Like he could basically commit just two squadrons of fighter bombers that at a crucial moment give air support to LNA resources or fighters, I should say. That could be enough to tip the balance. It could be enough to make it painful because, in a way, you could argue that Turkey is overextending itself right now. It's not that Azerbaijan is really going to blow up or anything, but they are in Syria and they are in Libya, and they have to commit more of their troops, not just their hired fighters. So, how long can they keep this going? Their economy is not that great. Problem with IMF loans as well. So yeah, it would not take much to halt the progress, and that the resumption to take Sitra, because of course it's not necessarily true that the whole country would fall and collapse just because Sitra would be taken over. Like, it would be kind of like they'd have the favor for sure, but then there's other contenders, like Russia's down, by the oil wells page out of America. And the eastern part of the country is controlled by the LNA. So it could become a lengthy battle for them. I don't know. It seems to me the only reasonable thing to do right now is figure out some kind of a deal where everyone is happy. Because if if Turkey can be convinced not to spread the Brotherhood into Egypt, okay, that's a win for Egypt. I'm not sure how much Egypt is concerned with the oil fields right now. If there was some kind of a dual project with the pipeline that would benefit the GNA and the LNA, I don't know if that's enough. I don't know what their ambitions are. At the moment, it sounds like their ambitions are, for total victory. But it's important to realize that there's probably not going to be total victory for either side.
Pragmatically, I think what we're looking at is the race for bargaining chips. I
Yeah.
think both sides are looking to grab up what valuable resources and land they can. So when a political solution is called, when the great powers step in, as it were, and try to broker a peace deal, they can play these cards at the table. They can play the oil wells. They can play the Muslim Brotherhood. They can play the uh, pipelines. Again, a multitude of different factors. They can play the counterterrorism card. And
Hmm.
I do think it's a race between the LNA and the GNA in order to see who can impress the international powers more, who can present a better case for a stable Libya. And it's pretty divided right now with the interests of the powers, not only the great powers, but the secondary powers now getting involved, like Turkey, like Egypt. And again, it's only a matter of time, at least from my estimation. Now, it could get a lot worse. Things have gotten a lot worse. I've been wrong about these predictions before. Before some sort of peace summit is forced.
Yeah.
And this is much less pertinent battleground than Syria. The U.S. has expressed much less interest in this, so it's not going to be this state of near perpetual war we see out of Syria. And with that, can you guess what we're talking about next?
We're going to Syria.
No, yeah, we are. And there is our map for Syria. And one of the biggest pieces of news there is there has been, it appears to be a bit of a Kurdish uprising to the point where they've taken back territory in the uh, in the northwestern part of Syria near Afrin.
Hmm.
And I'm genuinely surprised. I wouldn't have expected that. I thought they cut their losses in Afrin and went eastward, but apparently I was wrong. And there's been conflicts between them and the Turkish occupied zone in north central Syria with that light blue gray strip there with the yellow dots in it. I'm sure you can all see on the map. There, of course, has been the regular skirmishes in Deir ez-Zor, the resurgence of ISIS in eastern Syria, near all those precious oil fields. the usual patrol debacles where
Hmm.
American patrols just spend the day getting chased around Syria and definitely preserving our international reputation. That looks great on the world stage, believe it or not. Israel has been rather quiet lately. Idlib has been rather quiet lately. And again, the main news is out of northwestern Syria and out of eastern Syria. And I would say northwestern Syria is a bit more pertinent with, again, this Kurdish uprising right now. Now, will we see them capitalize on this? Will SDF forces, Syrian Democratic Forces, as it were, try to assist these uprisings? Will they push back against this occupation of Afrin? They've tolerated it for 2.5 years now with the tacit support of the American State Department. Of course, it's been a Turkish backed occupation of these various groups, similar case the Idlib. And my question is, will this come to a front? Or what I'm expecting is, will somebody pull the chain on the Kurds on the SDF? Now, the Kurds in Afrin, they have no control over, but the SDF, they do. Will they hope this burns out and this gets put down, or will they actually try to assist this? That's the big question. I think that's honestly the big question within the quote unquote deep state. I do think there's factions within the State Department, within the Pentagon, with the CIA that have very divided opinions on this. I'm sure there's plenty of people who want to support Turkey, and there's plenty of people who want to support the Kurds over Turkey. So it's not only us asking this question in terms of which will we support. I do think it's probably a pretty heated debate within the administrative state.
Yeah, it's this division. I think after 2015 was sort of inevitable and long in coming when Turkey decided to get more and more involved. It's hard to say which side they're going to support on the world stage.
Will this be another
America,
2015 where Pentagon and CIA forces fight each other? It may be.
yeah,
Stay tuned.
yes, that's right, that's right. Except, yeah, you're right, absolutely you're right. So there's a division, CIA versus Pentagon, Spider-Man versus Spider-Man, but this one is different because, of course, this made it into global news. The perception from the neoliberal order in Western Europe is that America, and for that matter, the liberal order within the U.S., is that America betrayed the Kurds, and now we have this swath of land that the poor Kurds could have had. I'm frankly not on either side of these people, so it'll be difficult to see which side they go. I think America would be interested in a kind of diminution of Turkish power. I think maybe they're thinking this is sort of getting out of hand, or like it's hard to say, but I'm sure there's another faction that is thinking, well, better to have an aggressive Turkey there because they're most of the time aligned with American interests than not.
Yeah, I do think there is a sentiment within the State Department, within the Pentagon, within the CIA, that Turkey needs to be humbled and put back in the line and needs to just go back to being the second largest military in NATO and playing by the rules. On the other hand, I will say that in this conflict, again, the Western European elite are doing the poor Kurds thing. I'm curious if Macron will capitalize. I'm curious if France will capitalize on this and say, we must support these Kurdish rebellions against their occupiers and oppressors. I mean, again, it's yet another way to expand his war of words against Turkey, if you will. They've had their run-ins in Libya. They've had their fallouts before, and I wouldn't be surprised if he uses this as yet another opportunity to throw a few blows at Turkey.
Yeah, it's undecided. It's been a complicated 5-6 years. So I don't know how they're going to be resolved. I imagine that if Biden is elected, that there probably will be. Um, I mean, it's way out there, but I would say if he got elected, there will be a push for some kind of unity of action. Uh, that might not be convincing one side that they're wrong and to desist, but basically like to shut up and go along with the plan, and that's the way it's going to be. Because I mean, for all we when we look back at 2016, if we think that Trump was just like the deepest of the deep state, like so that he didn't look like deep state. Even if we assume that, right, there are going to be people who are frustrated, who are probably a minority in the Pentagon, who would have looked at him and what his proposals were as a positive thing, right? That they didn't know any better. I mean, lots of people were, conceivably tricked or, put too much estimation into Trump and, what potential there could have been for change. And that was an easy mistake to make early on, before Flynn was fired. So all I'm saying is if there's been a contingent that has muddled things up, I think a Biden victory will smooth that over. There are other contingents that are more pragmatic. They're not ideologically based. They're simply about what can and can't be accomplished. So, but that's just my guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, especially if Syria heats up in the fall, which conflict, it seems Syria does follow a spring fall sort of pattern in the past couple years here where yeah, there'll be some activity in the summer. Winter is usually a dead zone in Syria, but it's always the spring offensives and the fall offensives. I do think what we'll get out of that during the election is that Biden will really try to campaign on Trump betrayed the Kurds. We can reassert American credibility in Syria, and we can help our allies seeking freedom and democracy from the oppressive Assad and the rowdy Kurds, and we can really stand up against them. And look, it may be a blow to Turkey, it may be a move to humble Turkey and keep an American foothold in Syria, but I do think that's the direction that in general, the neoliberal empire, whatever you want to call it, wants to go. And I think Biden or whoever's puppeteering Biden is on that same page.
Yeah, and the other thing I think to look out for with regards to a Biden victory is escalation in Ukraine. There's no doubt about that.
Ah, you saw that South Front video. I was just about to bring that
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
And then
Uh,
that and
I
one
mean,
other thing.
I always thought that anyways, because that would just be an extension of the let's say the Obama doctrine. Yes, I know that Trump helped Ukraine in some ways more than Obama. Yes, I know he armed them instead of just giving them defensive weapons, but Trump basically had to give his opponents a little bit of red meat just in order to quell things down on other fronts. But yes, I mean, I've always thought, just like I always thought, for instance, if Hillary won, that escalation in Ukraine would have been inevitable. Um, but the reason I just want to tie it into what you were saying because an escalation there, I think, would be a way to distract Russia from Syria, because that would give maybe I don't know either side more free hand in there, but the Russians, I don't think they're like really tied to the fate of the Kurds in Syria. So it'll be interesting to see what I think they can get out of it. It's kind of like all these ridiculous military maneuvers that they've been doing for 3 years in the Baltics and in Poland, as if like Russia's going to snap or something. Like, but I would definitely consider like the possibility of them um, urging Ukraine to heat up the war in Donbass.
Yeah, and Biden being in office, and with, of course, the entire Ukraine scandal, his family connections there, his business connections there, his family's
Yeah,
business connections there, the Ukrainians are going to feel emboldened. They're going to think our guys in the White House, and no, Biden, he'll support us crushing the Donbass. He won't be concerned at all. He'll stand up to Russia and Slava Ukraina with us. But uh,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like Ukraine did favor Hillary. They did like ask to work with Hillary on her campaign, and we're willing to divulge information on Russia and so on, and on and on Trump.
yeah,
So
one of
like,
Hillary's biggest, like, I think it was her communications director for the campaign. He's a very insufferable liberal on Twitter. His name is like Adam Parmenko or something very Ukrainian.
yeah,
And he always goes on about oh no, Trump, he's conceded so much to Russia. We have to stand up to Russian aggression. We have to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression. But the last thing I want to bring up in this show is a piece from the National Review. Now, I don't think I sent this to you, but it's worth saying because it touches on a point we've been making for a while. So, of course, as we all know, the National Review, a lot of these media outlets, a lot of these magazines, a lot of these newspapers are just a front for what the government wants to say for government press releases. And uh, this is from a man named Carlo J.V. Caro. And the headline reads, "We must not cede Afghanistan and Central Asia to Russia." Now, this is in light of the debates on whether we should withdraw more troops from Afghanistan, what our policy on Afghanistan should be going forward. And you have this piece put out then, because the arguments about Afghanistan have always been counterterrorism or improving the lives of the people there, helping towards social progress, infrastructure, economic development, whatever. And
so
um, it, economic development and whatnot. But now they are completely conceding that a large part of our presence in Afghanistan right now is a foothold in Central Asia and to counter Russia.
yeah, which is what we've been saying on the show for nearly 2 years, off and on, depending on which show people remember.
But I do think it's interesting because I don't think the initial mission to Afghanistan, I don't think for the first decade or so, or even the first 15 years, I think it was really post Crimea that Afghanistan became a mission about having a foothold against Russia in Central Asia.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the foothold in Central Asia was always there.
Oh, of
It was
course.
always right. It was always necessary. So of course, monitoring Russia was always important with a foothold in Afghanistan. But yeah, I agree with you. They first had to accomplish the mission of getting Osama and defeating the Taliban. They got one of those, um, and now it's I don't know. Now it's kind of like it is really about just keeping a foothold next to Russia, but it's going to cost them a lot. Uh, yeah.
It admittedly, because Afghanistan has become very unpopular with the American public at this point after, again, the virtual end of the war. The Taliban is I mean, the Taliban controls about half the country, but in terms of a combat force, they're virtually non-existent. Our deployments to Afghanistan don't really see combat anymore. Again, they're part of a quote-unquote peacekeeping force, whatever they mean by that. It can vary in terms of what they want them to do. So you have all of that, but beyond the blue wave resistor types that you see, beyond the liberal blue check marks, I don't think selling Afghanistan as a mission to contain Russia will go over well with anyone else aside from those people. Because, again, relations are bad. We are admittedly in another Cold War, but a lot of people really do not care about quote unquote Russian aggression wherever. Now, you could probably sell more of them if you say it's to counter Chinese interests, if it's there to protect against
Yes.
China, which I do imagine they will pivot towards soon. But even then, just Afghanistan alone is going to be unpopular, and just being deployed to some country that ends in Stan is going to be unpopular, even if you do appeal to the China hawks.
Right. And um, There have been sort of rumblings about China investing in Afghanistan, as a way to, um, I don't know, change Afghanistan's future in many ways. And of course, the other reason, America is in Afghanistan is because, of course, it keeps an eye on Iran too, um, which is next door. So, there's a multitude of reasons, and yeah, they're there. I think indefinitely. I think last year, maybe even earlier, I mentioned like you'll know that the American empire is dead is when they leave Afghanistan. So
Yeah, Afghanistan is the final frontier. We will hand NATO over to the French, to Europe. We will hand East Asia over to Japan. We will hand the Middle East over to Turkey or Saudi Arabia or whoever. But the minute we pull out of Central Asia, the minute we pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of that pivot point that again we can monitor Iran, Russia, and China from, the three biggest I wouldn't say rivals, but the three countries we've had the worst relations with in terms of actually going head to head with in the past decade. When we finally concede Afghanistan to one of those three or a combination of all those three, we have lost. Now, I will say with the contingency that if we somehow broker a deal with Pakistan to secure the region, but even then, even if we leave Afghanistan in the hands of Pakistan, it's not going to be the death of the American Empire, but it's going to be a very bad sign for the American Empire. But if there is ever a full withdrawal from Afghanistan, I'll just, again, as we said, it's going to be really bad, not only here but abroad, and the world's probably going to be in complete chaos before they finally let go of that final piece of the puzzle, because it all hinges on that modern American foreign policy. And again, this statement can be applied in many ways. Modern American foreign policy, the American empire, hinges on Afghanistan.
yeah, I think calling it the final frontier is pretty important, because of course China is now working more closely with Iran for more oil deals and more trade, oil deals for infrastructure. China's just going to bypass all these, like sanctions, all the sanctions. They're eventually just going to ignore them. And they'll find ways to work around. Not that the sanctions haven't been effective; they have, and it's why I think there's greater cooperation between China and Iran now. But Iran is not ceasing. Like they have delivered anti-air defense systems to Syria, and that would mean Syria's hands would be less tied in retaliation to Israeli strikes. Whether the technology is up for it, we'll probably find out in the next year or the next 6 months.
Now, I do think the big takeaway, just to close out this episode, it's a little shorter than our last ones, but that's okay. Our recording schedule was very weird this week. I'll just say that for the sake of being brief. I will say the
Yeah,
biggest
yeah,
takeaway is this week has showed the level of which not only secondary powers on the world stage, but countries that wouldn't even be considered powers within their own region can influence global politics at this point. How much
yeah.
of an uncertain state we're in, where a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia dominates the news, where Libya dominates the news to this day, almost 10 years after Gaddafi has been overthrown, where people are paying close attention to Egypt for an issue that's not related to Israel or the Suez Canal. That is where
Right,
we
right.
have reached in the current state of global politics.
Well said.
And that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another
Thank you.
episode of the War Report. We will see you next time, and goodbye.
And take care.